Okay, we're going to look now at a couple examples of how to distort text. Some of these use sequence text behaviors, and they all use ideas we've used before, and they build on those ideas. So here's one idea. We have this very simple comp that we've created before where we've got a background that's animated by applying the underwater filter to the gradient. A real easy way to distort text is to take that same underwater filter and apply it to the text. So one thing I do is just drag it to the group that contains both the text and the background, thereby distorting the text in exactly the same way as the background, and creating kind of a fun distortion effect. You can then, of course, modify this by going to the filters inspector and playing with the size of the distortion, the speed of it. You can slow it way down or speed it up. You make the size very small, speed it up, and adjust the amount of refraction. And another thing to realize this is, of course, everything is keyframeable, right? So if we wanted this to slow down over time and settle out, what we could do is start at the beginning like this. We'll move forward in time, and then we'll set the keyframe, for instance, for the speed and refraction and size, and move forward in time. And let's have the speed go down to 0. We'll have the size maybe stay the same, and the refraction go down to 0. So now if we play that back, we can start with some very distorted text that then settles out, and we can read what it says. And of course, we could apply this just to the text and not to the gradient if we wanted to. In fact, if I apply this just to the text, something you may notice in terms of the size, it actually works very well just as is. But sometimes what you want to do, notice the text now has a box around it, which means the text has now become rasterized because of applying the filter directly to the text. It's called rasterizing the text or flattening the text. You can also choose to flatten the text here, which will create a much more intense distortion effect because it applies the filter within the bounds of the text. So that's one option for flattening the text. If we don't do that, the distortion is applied to the overall composition. So that's one example for how you might want to distort text. Just to finish this off, if we wanted the text to fade in, rather than to show up like this, we could add a very simple fade in, fade out behavior. Basic motion, fade in, fade out, and the text would fade in and then settle down. So that's one simple option using the underwater filter. Let's look at another one. Here's a project that's a little more complex, but it builds on concepts that we've already discussed. So I have a background that has 3 filters applied, and let's turn them off to see what they're doing. So that's the basic background as it looks by default. I've added a gamma filter in order to make it look much more dramatic. If I go to the filters inspector, we can see the settings here. I've added a halftone effect to give it kind of a little bit of a comic book look. And then I've added a vignette filter to kind of darken around the edges. So that's the background. And the text here, I have a sequence text behavior as well as 2 parameter behaviors. And you can tell they're parameter behaviors by the little funnel in the middle of the icon. If you look in the timeline here, we can see the sequence text behavior acts on the text in the middle. So let's play this. So it creates a very, frantic kind of animation. And the way that it's working, if we select the text layer itself and go look at the behaviors, we've got the wriggle applied to the variance. In other words, this sequence text behavior has variance in terms of how it's animating the text. So if we look at the sequence text behavior itself, it's animating the position of the text in X, Y, and Z, and it's animating its rotation in X, Y, and Z, and it's tracking. But we've got some variance to that animation we've looked at before, which creates animation in different directions, and that variance is actually being controlled, we can see that little gear there, by a parameter behavior, which is this wriggle here. So it's really creating a great deal of randomness in how the text jumps around when we get into the sequence text behavior. If we then look at the randomized behavior, we can see it's randomizing the position of the text in X and Y. And that's why when we start out, the text is kind of jumping around. In fact, that little ball of red yarn there is the result of the randomized parameter behavior being applied to the position of the text. If I uncheck it, you'll see that little ball goes away, and the text does not move in the first part of the project. If I turn it on, the text starts out very shaky, Then the sequence text behavior makes it blast apart, and then it comes back together again. So there's another idea of creating kind of distorted text or very kind of kinetic text. Here's another example that we'll build from scratch. So almost from scratch. I have some text here in kind of a funky little font. The font, if I bring up the heads-up display, F7, is called Jelly Bean. And the sequence text behavior that's applied to it creates kind of a little bit of a crazy animation where it kind of spins into place. And if you remember before, when we looked at adjusting the anchor point for animating text, we did it in those behavior controls. So this one does the same thing. If we select the sequence text behavior and go to the text inspector, we can see in the behavior controls that we've got this large Y value. So the text is being animated in its rotation, but it's not rotating around itself. In fact, if I set the Y back to 0 here, we'll see that the text rotates around. Each letter is just rotating around themselves a little bit more. Let me undo that and then go back to the behavior itself, and we can see we're animating position and scale and rotation. So the text is kind of spinning onto the screen, and it's also blurred and becoming clear. Now I want to take this a little bit further using a concept for distorting text called a bump map. So what we're going to do is add something else to distort the text with the bump map. I'm going to start with some clouds. So I'm going to go to the library, and I'm going to go to Generators and select the Generators category. See, I have some third-party generators in here as well, but these are the built-in generators. I'm going to select Clouds. Clouds is an animated kind of fractal generator. So I'll apply it, and we get this big animated cloud thing going on. And if you look in the inspector, there's a variety of controls to impact exactly what this looks like. I'm not going to mess with those here. A lot of fun to play with this, though, to change the animation. But here's where I'm going with this. What I want to do is, first of all, I'm going to put that in a separate group. So I'm going to select the top group, press Shift-Command-N to create a new group, and put the clouds in there so they're separate. Then, with this group selected, I'm going to go to the library, to Filters, to the Distortion category, and choose this one called Bump Map. Now, if we select it, we can see it applies a bump map to an object using an image as a source. So we'll apply this to the group containing the text. And then let's turn off this group up here so we can still see the text. Let's move forward in time so we can see the text. Now, in the inspector for this bump map, there's a well. It says Map Image. So it says, I will distort the image, but you need to tell me what to use. Like, well, I want to use the clouds. So we'll drag the clouds into that well, and immediately we see the text change a little bit. Let's crank up the amount. Then things start to get kind of interesting. So now the text is being distorted based on those clouds. And since the clouds are moving, the distortion is changing. It's so much now that it's a little hard to read. Let's move it so we can see what it still says. So if we play that back now, we've got those clouds, and notice that we've got a little bit of where the animation is getting cut off there. So we can choose Repeat Edges and fix that there. And now when we play it forward, it looks more like a cloud coming down and forming some letters. Just kind of creates a cool, ghostly kind of animation, another kind of distorted animation. So 3 very different approaches to creating different ways of creating kind of distorted or frantic or animated text in different ways.